Hello, guys. These are your reading selections for lesson 2.1, The Force of Gravity. So, in this, we're going to read through this article. And again, as usual, just make notes in your science notebook at the end of the lab in the section for the reading section notes. All right, so this is on Hooke and Newton, Geniuses at Work. So, we're starting off at the bottom right. Cooperation pays off in science, but competition also has its rewards. Two of the leading scientists of the 17th century, two of the leading scientists of 17th century England, Sir Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke, were rivals almost all of their lives. Each made important contributions to physics. Robert Hooke discovered the nature of elastic force, and Sir Isaac Newton investigated light. The nature of gravity was a subject of fascination to both men. But they also had other scientific interests. Hooke studied his world in many ways, through a telescope as well as through a microscope. The microscope, which he built himself, Hooke looked at fish scales, feathers, and cork. He noticed that these objects viewed under magnification were made up of tiny compartments. He named these compartments cells. Hooke published a book titled Micrographica that contained many beautiful drawings of the things he'd seen in his microscope. Robert Hooke's investigation of forces resulted in Hooke's laws, which states that the force a spring exerts depends on how far it is stretched. So, before we go any further, if you look here at these images, you will see that these are the drawings from Hooke's notebook that he saw through his notebook. This is actually not Robert Hooke. This is Sir Isaac Newton. All right, so let's continue on the next page. Under the apple tree. Meanwhile, unknown to Hooke, Sir Isaac Newton had an unexpected opportunity to work on the gravity problem. Newton, who was a college professor, had some free time when the bubonic plague caused universities across Europe to close. In 1666, he returned to the farm where he'd grown up. One day, he was sitting under a tree, thinking serious thoughts, in this case about why the moon orbits the Earth. Suddenly, an apple dropped on his head. Newton's eyes lit up. A hypothesis. Perhaps gravity, the force that pulled the apple to the ground, was the same force that kept the moon and the planets in orbit. In other words, the same force that had long been known to operate on the Earth was holding the solar system together. Earth and the heavens might operate according to the same physical principles. So he's saying the planets would behave the same way as objects do here on Earth, being influenced by gravity. All right, so to continue, he did some mathematical calculation and he became convinced that his hypothesis was correct. Gravity holds the moon in its orbit as it revolves around the Earth. But Newton did not publish his findings. Time passed. 20 years later, other scientists were still trying to understand the force of gravity and explain what keeps the planets in their orbits. Among them was Hooke. By this time, Hooke and Newton both were famous for other discoveries, and they were also well known because of their rivalry that had grown between them. Hooke had publicly criticized some of Newton's theories about light. A third scientist, Edmund Halley, was a friend of both of the men. Halley asked Newton whether he understood how gravity kept an object in orbit. Of course, Newton probably replied, I figured it out 20 years ago. Well, Halley might have responded, you better watch out because Robert Hooke is pretty close to figuring it out too. Newton decided it was time to publish his findings on gravity. The result was a book that would become famous around the world, Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. In it, he described how gravity works, and it demonstrated that objects on Earth operate under the same principles as objects in space. The book also contains Newton's 3 laws of motion. So this is where we're going to be going here soon. We're going to be looking at Newton's 3 laws of motion. This is really putting Newton on the map. He's made several other discoveries, but this is something was one of his biggest things that he contributes to science. All right, so Sir Isaac Newton may have beaten Hooke in figuring out how gravity works, but both men made important discoveries and wrote books that have influenced science for centuries. Many people regard them as 2 of the greatest scientists of the 17th century. All right. So at this point, we're going to look at the discussion questions. So, number 1, how was the competition between Newton and Hooke constructive? Meaning, how did it push the men to do science and discover more? So specifically, go back and look at the left-hand column of this page, probably 4 paragraphs down, and it'll help you answer that. And there's a few other references. So if you need to refer back, go ahead and refer back. All right, number 2. What types of tools did Hooke, Newton, and other scientists use to test their hypotheses? So go back and look on the first page and the second page of this article and look for items that, or look for tools that these scientists use to help them make discoveries, and just list them. All right, so that will wrap up the reading selections for lesson 2.1, the force of gravity. If you find this helpful, not a bad idea to reread this or re-listen. It's got a lot of good information in here. So, you guys have a good day.